So I am Laura Shoppy. I'm the founder and president of Fuentech, and I have been playing around with metrics for a long time, using primarily Autumn's metrics. And we look at them to analyze offices and how they're performing, as well as people, departments, colleges, all sorts of aspects of it, and then also use them as a communication tool to help tech transfer offices manage up as well as manage down and manage their operations. And so the communication aspect is just as important as analyzing the data. And so we'll give you some very high overview of how to do that. So again, we are using the Autumn stat data, and it is important to recognize that when that gets published every year, your local newspapers and your administration may very well come out and say, how are we doing by comparison to all of these players? Well, the numbers that typically come out are the raw numbers. And that is not an appropriate way to compare yourself to other universities. You really need to normalize that data, and you need to look at specific performance ratios. And so one of the normalization factors that is pretty typically used is $10 million in research expenditures. And so, for example, like invention disclosures per 10 million in RE, the average these days has been 3.5 to 4 invention disclosures per 10 million. It used to be 2 million. So we are getting more productive as tech transfer offices, as well as universities, in converting research dollars into inventions, and then hopefully also into productive licenses. The ratios really help you look at different aspects of performance. And I'm not going to be able to share with you all of the different ratios that we look at in order to analyze an office's performance or personnel's performance. But I am going to try to highlight some of those aspects so that you can go back and look at your own data. So when you are benchmarking, you are typically comparing yourself against other universities. And the Autumn stat database is the easy one to use because it gathers all of that data. As you know, Autumn's got 3,000 institutions, but they typically participating in the stat program of collecting those metrics on a yearly basis is closer to 300 institutions. I encourage you all to participate in that every year, because the more data there is, the better it is for all of us in understanding what's really going on in the industry, and it helps you in doing your analysis. But you want to be careful in how you are making that comparison. So Autumn provides their average information, and they provide some of the highlights of specific universities. Well, the Autumn average includes institutions that are not necessarily like you. So it's more than just universities. It can also include research institutions, medical hospitals, government labs, and they don't all operate in the same way that you do. It can also be state universities versus private universities. So you want to try to pick institutions that are similar to you. Now that means making sure that if you have a medical school, you are comparing yourself with other universities with medical schools. Or if you don't have a medical school, believe me, you do not want to compare yourself with those that have med schools, because their licensing revenue tends to be quite a bit higher than those that do not have med schools. And whether you're comparing state university versus non-state, that actually doesn't make that big a difference. So I would not use that as a particular parameter, but you do want to make sure that you're in the general ballpark of the same levels of research expenditure and making sure it's medical versus non-medical. Now, one of the key things in doing comparisons, especially when you're talking to your administration or your local media, is that they tend to look at your peers as being whoever's in your athletic conference. Well, that's not relevant when it comes to the research aspect of what your university does. And so educating them in that is a long, hard battle, and you are not going to convince them forever to recognize that when they look at your performance from a technology transfer perspective, they shouldn't be looking at the athletic conferences, because they will naturally always do that because of so many other things that they use that as comparative base. So one of the ways that you might be able to combat that is take the athletic conference peer group as one data set, versus your real peers when it comes to research, and use it as a educational process when you are presenting your data, and do it on a regular basis, at least once a year, to continue to reinforce that message of our real peers are these versus the athletic conference when we're talking about research. And then they'll be able to starkly see why the data looks different. And you'll see in a minute how that might represent itself. The other thing to make sure you're looking at is how you analyze the data for internal purposes, not just for external benchmarking. So your institutional level data, that's what you report into Autumn, and that's what you can use the Autumn database for. But you can also take a look at people's performance, both within your tech transfer office as well as inventors in particular, also at the department and the college level. And these are great opportunities for finding where you may be able to garner additional inventions perhaps, or identify where you've got really productive either inventors or departments, and maybe use a little bit more resources to foster that relationship. Now, the other part of the educational process in educating your stakeholders, whether it is, again, your administration or maybe the public, if you're a public university, there's usually a lot of interface with the legislatures and media, is to help them understand that not all aspects of what go into tech transfer are in your control. So it's a pipeline, and the pipeline starts with investment, and that's the research expenditures that come into your university. And so what impacts innovations on the back end are how much money comes in and the diversity, like where that money is coming from, the type of money you've got coming in. And as a tech transfer office, you have almost no control over what that is. So again, helping them realize there's only so much money coming in and this much coming out. The next step in that is how that money is used in creating innovations. And that's really more the inventors. And again, you've got some limited control over the quality and the quantity of the inventions that happen, but you can educate your inventors to make sure that they are aware that they should be submitting invention disclosures, and try to improve the quality of those disclosures, as well as their understanding of the markets that would use any types of inventions they have, because the more knowledgeable they are about industry, the better their chances are of addressing problems that might be relevant. Now comes the next stage in the pipeline, and this is where you really do start having a lot more impact and performance metrics matter in what you're doing. And that's the strategy and then the deal output that happens as a result of the innovations that are created by your inventors. And so the strategy is, how well are you evaluating and being efficient and effective in that evaluation process and your IP strategy? And then how effective are you in marketing the technology and then getting good license deals out of it? And there you really do have influence, and that's where you really want to make sure that you've got the best quality staff and the best procedures, processes, and activities going on to maximize your output. Now, again, we use lots of different parameters that we look at, and because we're trying to do this in a short period of time, only going to hit one in every one of those pipeline categories. So investment is the money coming in. That is looking at how much money you've got and where it's coming from, federal versus industry funding. And then in this case, I've picked a university and comparing it because this university does not have a medical school. So I compare it to non-medical school average within Autumn, and then my own peer group to really understand how am I doing compared to them. Very quickly looking at it, I can see my university, I am probably a state school because I have a lower percentage of federal and industry money coming in. So I am probably getting most of my money from the state. If it's a small university, or not many universities within that state, they're probably not super competitive in getting those research dollars, and that's going to impact the next layer, which is innovation. If they don't have to be very competitive in the type of research that they are proposing, and they're getting research dollars because they're going to go to the university anyway, you're not necessarily going to get as many invention disclosures out of it. And we see that in the fact that our invention disclosures per 10 million is less than half of what we're seeing at our peer institutions or other Autumn schools that don't have med schools. So that's troublesome and concerning. And on top of that, I can also look at how my staffing is going to see whether maybe I am understaffed. Well, it looks like I am understaffed, but I'm going to have a hard time convincing them that I should staff up when I don't have more invention disclosures coming in. And again, lots of other parameters that we might look at that will help us in identifying whether we are properly staffed and have the right number and the right quality of people. Now, another thing to look at on the strategy is our patenting efficiency. So again, my school is way over on the right. Here I am showing you the autumn average, the med school average, the non-med school average, and my peers to just show you how different it looks and how it can change how your metrics are interpreted. But I can tell from my school that I am getting a provisional on almost everything, but I'm patenting very little. Now, that can be for a whole bunch of reasons. And if I look at an additional metric on my patenting fees or my legal fees per patent application, it's also indicating that I probably have a very low patent budget. And that includes that I'm not getting a lot of reimbursable patent expenses back in my licenses. So that's a flag that this might be an area that I could do better. Now, why am I getting so few patents? Could be I have very little money, could be I have low innovation, because again, going back to my innovation rate was low, so maybe very few of my inventions need to be patented or should be patented. So there could be a variety of reasons why this happens, and again, multiple metrics will help you get there and understand what's happening and try to pinpoint how you can fix things. Then the outcome, that last block of what's our return on investment and the deals that we are making. Again, my university is not doing well here. I am way below my peers in my licensing income for 10 million and way below the autumn average for non-med schools. My staff is also not super efficient by comparison to its peers when I normalize or use the ratio of licensing income per FTE or even per license. I am underperforming. So this is an indication that I may want to look at my staff as well as try to shake the tree a little bit more and get better innovations or better educate my innovators for higher potential or slightly better inventions, hopefully, or more inventions, because the more inventions I put into the pipeline, the better chances I have of getting good inventions that can be licensed. In looking at my licenses to startups, I also see that I am very high compared to my other peers, which contributes to my low licensing income. So we see this a lot with state universities where their legislatures put a lot of pressure on state universities to do lots of startups. And they don't always understand that if you do more startups and you have a requirement to do that, it means you're going to have less licensing income. So here is another opportunity for educating them on, you can't have both at the same time. And so if I'm going to have a lot of startups, I'm not going to see a lot of licensing income. And this really exemplifies that. So a real quick example of why peer selection matters. In this case, this is a real case of a university that we worked with, and they had their peer set that was defined by their administration, and that's the graph on the left-hand side, and their performance looks pretty darn bad by comparison to the peer set. Well, that peer set included med schools and non-med schools and some of their athletic competitors, but it was primarily people that they, from a prestige perspective, wanted to be perceived in that group. Well, it turns out from a research perspective, that was not a fair match. And so when we took a look at what we would consider to be their true peers, yes, they're still not outperforming their peers, but they're not as bad as they would have appeared with the administration's peer set. So an opportunity to influence and really have a more serious conversation about who are our peers and how should we be performing by comparison and why might they be doing better than us in these different categories. Now, I know I did not answer all or address all of the different ways we can look at metrics because there are tons of them. If you have ever looked at the Autumn Stat database, it is just columns and columns and columns of data. And we look at a lot of it, and we look at it in all sorts of different ways. But wanted to cover at least some key points. So we created a handout that you can get that highlights these things, but at the bottom, it gives you some of the key metrics that we do look at, and it gives you the Autumn average as well as the med school average and the non-med school average, so that you can use that to compare yourself and use the spreadsheets yourself, but use those numbers for comparison purposes. And you can download all of this at this website. And you can also get to the other tools in 10 that we did yesterday if you're interested in the innovator pitch. So with that, thank you very much for your time.